So it's been a long, wild ride with telehealth in the last year. And I can share, at least from my perspective, what it's like presenting even now in this webinar format. We don't have the ability to see any of you. And so it's such an interesting experience to not have any kind of immediate nonverbal feedback. So I'd encourage you profusely to use the chat feature as often as you feel inclined. So if there's something that's funny, you're welcome to laugh in the chat as well. But if you have questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to put those in the chat as they come to you. If we can address them in that moment and it kind of fits, then great. Otherwise, we'll parking lot it until that panel discussion, the second half of this presentation. But for all jokes aside, my name is Caitlyn McClure. As Chris said, I am the clinical director over at Northern Illinois Recovery Center, and I am joined by two fantastic colleagues who I will allow to introduce themselves.
All right, I will go first. My name is Meagan Schultz. I am a primary therapist here at Northern Illinois Recovery. I also supervise our interns. And then I have kind of like a dual role as well, where I am a private practice therapist out of Stable Way Counseling Services.
I guess it's my turn then. Hi, everyone. I'm Erika Heatley. I am a primary therapist here at Northern Illinois Recovery, and I also run the day IOP program that was primarily held virtually. So I have a lot of good feedback from some of my clients too. So you guys get to hear a little bit about that.
Awesome. So this group has gone through a lot, not just our team at Northern Illinois, but I'm sure all of you who are joining us today. I don't know what all profession-wise is represented here. Obviously, we're speaking from our experience in substance abuse treatment. We've done both PHP and IOP virtually. So for those unfamiliar, PHP is 5 hours a day, 5 days a week, virtually. And then IOP is typically 3 hours a day, 3 to 5 days a week. So we've done a lot of services virtually in the last year. And much like the rest of you, we did it with no infrastructure on how to do it and how to do it well. I think we could all agree that 18 months ago, nobody knew what Zoom was. And so maybe a couple of you who were like on the cusp of technology knew what Zoom was, but the rest of us kind of had to take a crash course where it was, hey, we're shutting down things in person and everything must go virtual as of 48 hours from now. And so the experience then was, how do we set up an account and what features do we utilize and how do we still provide quality care and those valuable interactions and face-to-face with people when we're not face-to-face. So in jest, and hopefully you'll notice that we're a pretty lighthearted group of presenters. And through this experience, I feel like that's a huge part of why people are successful in providing virtual services is because we have to have a sense of humor. There's so many moments that go awry. So as much as we joke about are you there? You're frozen, you're muted, I can't see you, you're a black square. All of those things I think would account for every meeting we've started in the last year in some capacity, whether with clients or staff. Regardless of age and technological capacity, there's just so many barriers that we didn't know existed until we had to overcome them. So first of all, I just want to say thank you all for joining us today and for your commitment to learning more and being able to share that. And I also want to just validate the experience it is for all of you and the barriers that you've had to overcome to continue to do the work that you've committed your life to. So we're really grateful that you could be here with us today. So I thought it would be helpful to really kind of kick us off a little bit and just like, what is telehealth? As a framework for the discussion and moving forward, what are virtual services, right? Because that is the crux of the issue. So telehealth is a broad span term that encompasses a lot of things. I would say that it's probably not used regularly in the school setting. So if any of you are joining us from the school setting, I'd love to know kind of like what your reference term has become for how you describe virtual. If it's just, yeah, we're virtual or whatnot. But for us in our profession as a provider in kind of a longer term care setting, we use telehealth regularly. And there's been some hot debate about like, is telehealth the right term? Telemedicine was cool for a few minutes. So we weren't sure if we were supposed to and so there's enough research now to say telemedicine is very different and distinct than telehealth. But it was kind of like when we all got thrown in with the Zoom virtual world or whatever platform you use, we've had to use Zoom for the last year. we just had to kind of absorb what we could, and we're like, oh, they call it this. All right, perfect. We're going to call it that too. And then as we've learned the nuances of those different explanations, we've kind of moved into a more meaningful representation of telehealth. So I'm going to shift my folks around so that way I can actually see my definition. So this is a quick definition that I thought was helpful. It says telehealth is defined as the delivery and facilitation of health and health-related services. I'd like to clarify too, like, what does it mean to have health and health-related services? I think that this is where telemedicine really came in, is we started this idea with like health-related services being those very clear-cut physical health-related issues. But as we've gone through a global pandemic and all the implications of that, we know that health is so much bigger than just if your blood pressure is okay, or if you're having another medical related issue. It's also all the social emotional pieces that people have had to overcome because they do have physical health impacts. So those mental health issues, we've seen those numbers go up quite a bit in the last year. Just we were just talking about suicide rates have gone up quite a bit as well. Obviously overdoses in our field in the substance abuse world have also increased. And so when we talk about health-related services, I think that that's a broader stroke than we would have considered even a year and a half ago while talking about virtual service provision. So they have it listed as including medical care, provider and patient education, health information services, and self-care via telecommunications and digital communication technologies. So they kind of, in the end, tossed in that little bit of like self-care, which we use a lot as providers. But I don't think we think about that sometimes in regards to how we're supporting some of the other components of the people we serve, whether you refer to them as patients or clients or consumers. They have a lot of self-care needs because, I mean, the reality is they've done so much to care for themselves in this time of isolation and independence. And so what it really comes down to is how are we assisting the people that we care about and are serving in their self-care? Because ultimately it's us partnering with them, but like they do a lot of the work that we were able to do when we were face to face. And I know we've experienced that a lot of, sometimes it's giving a lot of tools because I can't walk with you literally through that process the way I could in an office. So I thought this was a helpful and kind of all-encompassing definition. And just like a little bit further into the weeds. So the difference between telemedicine and telehealth, I think of this as kind of like a math terminology. All telemedicine is telehealth, but not all telehealth is telemedicine. Telemedicine focuses on the provision of long-distance clinical healthcare services, whereas telehealth is that broader scope. And I thought this was really interesting is it can refer to those non-clinical services as well, like provider training, administrative meetings, staffings between providers and consultation. And it's because it's still focused on that client care aspect, that patient care aspect. And it's happening virtually. I know that it's kind of funny because we're all here at the same facility functioning from our separate offices on the virtual platform today. And that's something that we've gotten so accustomed to, that regular meetings, we have a morning meeting where we're all in our own offices, Zooming together because we're trying to prevent as much contact as possible while we're, still keeping everyone as safe as we can. And so there's an element of that is still considered telehealth, even though it's not providing a direct service to a client or a patient. So I think that's just a helpful groundwork for us to build for our further discussion today. And with that, I'm going to let Meagan launch us into our next portion.
Alrighty. So for me, I am going to just do a brief overview on some ethical considerations of providing virtual services. So with that, I'm going to focus on a few different areas. The first one being the efficacy of virtual services, looking at some of the privacy concerns with providing services, ways to go about risk mitigation, and then I'll look at some accessibility and other considerations under our virtual telehealth providing. So the first area that I wanted to touch on is the efficacy of providing virtual services. So for me, this is really heavily focused on the efficacy of specific therapeutic approaches. I know that Caitlyn went through definitions of telehealth and telemedicine. So I have an additional one to kind of add in there as a caveat to a lot of the research that has been done. So there is another term that has been utilized in a lot of the research that I have seen called internet delivered interventions. And this is unfortunately even broader of a definition in terms of virtual services being provided to clients in a therapeutic setting. So internet delivered interventions can range anywhere from a clinician emailing a client a resource that they can utilize online. World might look like a client on codependency. That service can also go as far as to the direct providing of therapeutic interventions in a Zoom setting, much like this one, and everything in between. So that is my caveat to some of the research that I'll be talking about today. So in general, the research shows that there is a comparable efficacy between internet delivered interventions and in-person interventions for therapeutic approaches such as CBT, ACT, and interpersonal therapy. So these are three common in our general in-person services. And these are three of the primary interventions that have a high level of efficacy for the mental health and substance abuse services that we provide typically in person. And so a lot of this research is comparing the efficacy of these three because they are shown to be effective in general. The first area is CBT. So these studies looked at providing CBT in person and comparing that to the internet delivered intervention. Of CBT, and it has demonstrated that there is a high correlation between the level of involvement of the clinicians, effective we see those interventions to be. So with that, if we are looking at the general internet delivered CBT to in-person CBT, it is shown to be effective in the treatment of depression, anxiety disorders, and eating disorders. Acceptance and commitment therapy had similar efficacy rates. The only difference is that the efficacy for acceptance and commitment therapy as a virtual service was compared to the internet delivered CBT rather than in-person acceptance and commitment therapy. One of the interesting pieces of this piece of research is that we saw a lot more dropout when looking at acceptance and commitment therapy being provided virtually. So people who stuck with services showed similar outcomes. However, it was significantly higher dropout rates due to lower client satisfaction when they were receiving acceptance commitment therapy virtually. And the last one is the interpersonal therapy. So similarly, they compared interpersonal therapy provided in a virtual setting to CBT provided in a virtual setting. And they found similar efficacy in treating anxiety disorders, including social anxiety and panic disorder. And in general, it demonstrated an overall effectiveness in decreasing general anxiety symptoms. One of the things that was interesting in this piece of research was that there wasn't a significant improvement in the panic-related symptoms. So all that to say, there is definitely a need for continued research, especially with the broad scope of internet delivered interventions and this move toward the clinicians being a very direct and primary provider over telehealth services. Some privacy concerns to consider. So the first and probably most important piece of this is whether or not these platforms are HIPAA compliant. So there is an increased risk in terms of data breaches and hacking. Some of the platforms that we have used that are HIPAA compliant and meet those criteria would be platforms such as Zoom, like we're using today. And with that, it is the professional version of Zoom. And then a lot of organizations, including my private practice, have utilized Doxy as another HIPAA compliant platform. The second concern or consideration is how conducive the environment is to the clients that are engaging in services. So when you look at the increased accessibility of virtual services, people are now able to engage in those services from anywhere. A lot of people, especially during shutdown and quarantine time, were engaging in services from their home. And this creates some privacy concerns in terms of their access to a private and quiet space, people walking in and out of the home setting. This is especially important for people who are working on family-related goals. So that idea of, I had a bunch of teenagers who were actively working on how to engage and how to have more positive relationships with their family members. And so that was really challenging to have them talk about those situations when their family is very present and capable of overhearing some of those conversations. The second piece is I have had a lot of clients and myself engage in telehealth services from a work setting. So again, taking into consideration the level of privacy that those work settings can offer, whether that client has access to a private office, whether they have the ability to utilize sound machines. I did have a client this past week who attempted to complete his intake with me from his office. And first question I asked was, what brought you to substance abuse services? And he immediately shut down and was like, I think I need to move. And so we ended up having to complete his intake from his phone in his car because he was not comfortable with the possibility of his coworkers overhearing our intake evaluation. Another concern is, especially for me with a lot of my teens, because it's so accessible and you can jump onto a session on your phone. I have had people who are attempting to engage in our clinical services in public places. And so that creates a privacy concern for the client with random people in and out. But the last part of it is the implications for group engagement. So it's a lot easier to look at privacy and being HIPAA compliant when you have the ability to manage in a safe and structured environment like our office setting or our IOP building. But when we have people that are engaging in groups from other settings, it is really important for us to reinforce that boundary that there cannot be other people in the room when they are participating in group. The last part on here is the conduciveness of environment from which the provider is providing services. So like I said, a lot of us had to provide services from our own homes when things were shut down and we were not able to come into the office. So one, creating a sense of safety and compliance with privacy in our own homes, but also working to navigate the challenges of home life. So whether that is having kids at home or having dogs that you can hear in the background or a roommate that comes in and out of the house. So just navigating some of those real life situations. And then the last one probably seems odd to include, but this is something that we experience often in our work here at NIRC. All of us have sticky notes on our door right now that say, please do not disturb. Because as we are providing virtual services, you don't have that person sitting on your couch. So if people are walking by, they oftentimes will not think that you are currently in a session. So I've had that experience of people walking in and out of my office as I am trying to meet with a client virtually. So those are all things that have been challenges to navigate. And we will talk about what are some strategies for that later on today as well. The next part is risk mitigation. So we had to make some changes in terms of our process when it comes to the increased risk of providing virtual services. So the first part of that is updating informed consent. So having the ability to communicate some of those potential increases in risk to the clients so that they are able to be informed and make the decision of whether or not they do want to participate in virtual services. The second piece is assessment of the level of appropriateness for telehealth services. I was talking just very anecdotally with my team earlier this week about how I have noticed that since quarantine and since the beginning of the pandemic, I no longer have any clients under the age of 17. And so really taking a look at which populations are appropriate for telehealth services. And with that, what is a realistic accommodation that you and your practice can make to increase the level of appropriateness for telehealth services for the clients that you are providing that care to. The next piece is risk assessment and safety planning. So with this, and this is very just coming from my crisis-minded brain, looking at how do we manage risk and safety planning virtually. So how are we able to effectively complete a mental status exam over Zoom? How are we able to engage a client in safety planning in that virtual setting where they don't have that tangible plan in front of them to look at? For me, one experience that I had was being on a Zoom call with a client who was expressing suicidal ideations. And luckily for me, I was in an office setting where I could call someone on my phone or shoot an email so that I had a peer who could help me facilitate a well-being check while I kept the client engaged on the screen. But with that, it was really important for us to have updated information in regards to emergency contacts. I know for me at private practice, we also made sure to have a client provide the information of where they will be completing services. So if they were going to be engaging in our services from their home, from their office, what was that address and what were the closest hospitals or what were the local police stations that we could have the information for in case a well-being check was needed. The next part is very provider-centered. So there are specialized trainings and certifications in the implementation of telehealth services. So just increasing our competency as we are growing in our provisions of telehealth services. And then the last piece is looking into what your liability insurance covers. I know for me, I had to get an additional liability insurance coverage in terms of telehealth services that I had to add this year as I was providing those services to my clients. And the last part is just very general accessibility and considerations. So some of the challenges that have popped up as providers is that we have different governing bodies and they all have their own regulations. So how can we stay in compliance with all of those governing bodies and continue to provide the care that is needed for our clients? The second piece is providing interstate services as it pertains to licensure. So a lot of people have this, have been advocating for the ability to find ways to navigate multi-state virtual licensing to increase access to care. I think this is especially relevant to us here in the Northern Illinois area, as we sometimes have clients that are coming from Wisconsin. So navigating that, I'm here in Illinois providing a service, but my client receiving the service is Zooming from their home in Wisconsin. And so I have my licensure here in Illinois. I do not have that license in Wisconsin. The next part is just the accessibility of technology. We see, especially in underserved populations, a decrease in their accessibility to technology. And with that, how can we navigate to ensure that those underserved populations are not becoming further underserved? With that too, kind of looking at the cost benefit for the organization and the individual. what is your organization capable of providing in terms of like staff and materials and technology equipment. And for the client, like whether or not they are comfortable with receiving services in that way, whether they have the option of going elsewhere for in-person services, and kind of meeting them where they're at in terms of what works best for them. And the last piece is insurance reimbursement and coverage. So Illinois has had some provisions in the pandemic time to allow for increased access to insurance reimbursement. But I know for us, we have still had some challenges in that area. Erika could probably speak to this, just having a client who, because we were out of network, their insurance was not willing to pay for and cover our care that was virtual. So just some other considerations moving forward in the virtual world.
Thanks, Meagan. And I think to speak to kind of that situation Meagan was bringing up, I think it just furthers the myth that telehealth services are a different kind of service, or that they're ineffective, or a different quality of care, that an insurance company says, I won't pay for a telehealth at the same level, the same number of hours, the same provider, but I'd pay for it in person. So I think that as we continue to move forward in our understanding of the efficacy pieces, especially of telehealth services, especially for particular populations and folks for access reasons, I think that'll be huge. But it just kind of reinforces where we're at with things, where everyone's had to embrace telehealth, and everyone says that there's, you know, some pros and cons, and oftentimes we lean on the side of cons because it's just been such a challenge. There's been so many barriers, but I think that sometimes we overlook the pros of telehealth. So I'm going to let Erika lead us into kind of the next portion, talking about how services have changed for providers and for clients, both pro and con.
Alrighty, so, you know, now that we got some of this research and understanding, right, that we all have been experiencing, right, but we haven't necessarily been able to kind of put it into, okay, how does this affect us, right? How does this affect who we are as facilitators in whatever realm that looks like, right? Whether that be in, you know, an outpatient setting, whether that be for us here in PHP or IOP, or for our folks who are in a school setting, or, you know, and on, right? And what we've noticed is there has been so many changes, not only for us, but also for our clients, right? Also for the people that we serve on a daily basis. And so what I kind of did was just gather some information around not only what we've been experiencing right here together as a team at NIRC, but kind of what other people's experiences have been with them providing those services also. And I think really what these came down to was a lot of the pieces that we kind of talk about in the research, but now making it more humanized, right? Making it more like, hey, this is actually what we're experiencing. And let's talk about how difficult this is as a facilitator, right? I remember when I first started doing telehealth services, and it was like, okay, like Caitlyn was saying earlier, right? Like, okay, here you go, figure it out. And I remember doing one of my curriculums, right, which I have in here, of like being able to adapt your curriculum. One of the big pieces for me is like, I did this curriculum and it failed, like bad. And I had clients give feedback of like, yeah, Erika, this didn't work in this capacity, you know, which was hard for me because I was like, dang, like this works really, really well when we're in person, right? People are so engaged and so excited about this curriculum, which is why I wanted to bring it into telehealth, right? And what we notice is that when we're adapting this curriculum, you know, you don't realize it, you don't realize, you know, how it's going to be so different until you're doing it, right? So that brings in some of that, like adapting curriculum, as well as, you know, the piece of just us being able to realize that like we are human and we are going to make mistakes on here, and yeah, they're going to be shown, but really having a sense of humor about it, right? Like I talked with my clients afterwards and I was like, I apologize. Like I thought this would work really well, and I actually got their feedback, right? And it was a really important conversation that we were able to have of like, what would have worked better, right? And I was able to adapt based on what my clients' needs were on this platform, which is really important. So one of the, or some of the other things that I have on here as well is like different levels of vulnerability. Meagan talked to, the research piece of it, of noticing like, hey, there are going to be times for both as facilitators and as clients that maybe we have, the dogs are barking in the background. I know at one point I was running, group from home, and I remember my arm just like constantly going like this. And I was finally like having to address it, because it was happening on screen, but nobody else could see what was actually going on. And it was my dog nudging me, thinking I was talking to him, not necessarily the people that were on the computer, right? So I had to like give more information than I probably usually would. And it makes it a little bit more human, right? It's not that, I think Caitlyn brought this up when we were having a conversation as we were going to do this presentation of like, it's not like seeing your teacher, out at the grocery store and being like, oh God, avoid, right? And vice versa. It's very much like, hey, you're in my home with me, and I'm in your home with you, as we're doing some of these telehealth services, especially when we all could not be in a capacity where we were together at all, right? Where everybody was at home providing services in whatever way that looked, like maybe not even being able to go into the office as even an option, right? So that changes that vulnerability level between us and our clients, I think, but also allows them to maybe either feel more comfortable or less comfortable with their vulnerability and what they're willing to share, as you're talking to them over this platform, because you don't know what's happening in the other room, and maybe they're trying to have a conversation about their spouse, and their spouse is in the next room doing their work, virtually as well. Maybe not in a therapeutic setting, but definitely, in a work setting where they're having to be in the next room over. And it's like, how much do I say? How much are they going to know? Even if the door is shut, even if they're in, an environment that feels or is safe, right? It can be a little bit wonky in that way. So some of the other things that we've experienced here has been some hybrid groups. We at one point were trying to have like part of our folks being in person, especially because we have a PHP with housing component, which allowed us to keep them safe in that way, even though COVID was happening, because they would get a COVID test before they came in. They were able to go from housing, transported by us, to clinical and vice versa. There was never that other interaction. However, we also had some folks who were, doing IOP who don't have that option of housing, right? And so we were having to figure out how this was going to work best. And in the beginning, we tried to have them Zoom in, right? Come in and be on the screen, even though other people were in person. And what we really found, and what I'll talk about a little bit later, is that it didn't work well. We tried it for a long time and it just didn't work well, specifically for the clients. I mean, it was hard for the facilitators as well, of making sure, it's an extra thing to manage, of making sure you're talking to the folks who are on the screen, remembering that they're there. And then also having all these people in person and having to manage body language, having to manage somebody wanting to speak on something, right? Like there's so many different components that get really difficult to manage as a facilitator. So some of these other things would be like difficulty with fellowship. This comes directly from my clients, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. And then people who just struggle with technology in general, right? We have some folks who have never used Zoom, right, ever in their entire life, or they've never had access to maybe even an email, right? Like I've had these experiences with some of our clients, and it gets really difficult because it does go back to that, like, okay, maybe we're spending the first 10 minutes a group just trying to get so-and-so onto the group so everybody can have them there. And the other group members, I know from my side of things, have always been like, no, it's fine. We'll wait for them. It's all good. They don't want to start without them because they are a group, right? It probably would look similar for like students, right? Of like other students be like, well, where is Johnny? And you're like, well, we're trying to help Johnny get on here, maybe he's having some struggles too. So we just have a bunch of different kind of pieces that are all kind of laid out here, but I'm going to talk about them in specific and separated between client and facilitator. So for the client piece of things, really, I broke this down. First, it was a pros and cons list, and then I realized, sadly, like Caitlyn was saying, a lot more cons were coming up. And obviously, this isn't an exclusive list. There's much more, and I would love to hear from you all of things that you've experienced or that your clients have experienced, or students, or however you address them. to really, talk about some of these struggles that they're having and how we can come up with some supports for them, right? As we're kind of navigating this system together. Even though it's been a year, it feels like we're all still constantly needing to learn, right? There's constantly changes, there's constantly things going on. So some of the big things that I've really noticed that have been really helpful for clients and feedback that I've gotten back from my own clients has been the ability to do therapy in a place that they are comfortable, right? So sometimes they choose comfort over, being willing to be pushed in some ways when it comes to some of the stuff they're willing to talk about in those comfortable spaces, especially while they're at home, right? But this is really helpful because for those folks who have to go to work, right after group ends, even if that is at noon, they're able to, get ready for work in the morning, get ready to go, come onto this Zoom, and then be able to get to their job on time. Right? That's one thing that maybe they wouldn't be able to do if they were in person, right? That might be extra driving time. That might be extra gas that they don't have money for. That might not be a vehicle they have access to, right? So it provides so many people with so many more services, which is so very helpful. Another thing, right? We talk about accessibility, and really the accessibility to telehealth services across the board, right? If a student is really struggling with an assignment, I'm sure they could jump onto, I know one of my best friends is a special education teacher, and what she's done is just literally had a Zoom open, even when she doesn't have class during certain hours, the kids can jump on and they can have that conversation, right? So that accessibility to their teacher, even when potentially, right, we don't have the space to just be able to walk in the teacher's room and be like, hey, this is what's going on. So that's really helpful. The convenience of it, of just being able to say, like, here we are, right? Like, okay, maybe I don't want to drive to go see my therapist that's an hour away, right? I just moved personally, so that's actually my own example, right, of doing my own telehealth still with my therapist who lives in the city as I've moved to the suburbs, right? And that's allowed me to continue to meet with her and have those experiences. She already knows me. Of course, for all you therapists out there, right? That have your own therapist, like we attach to our therapist, we really do. And for me, that was a really difficult part, but knowing that with telehealth services coming out, I could still meet with her and still have her, somebody who knows my whole story, right? It's helpful in that way. And that really talks to these like different barriers that get taken out of the way for us to be able to access these. Right. So this would be for groups, this would be for individual sessions, this would be for, in the school setting, right? Being able to realize that like maybe some of, our folks that are coming in, they don't have access to the transportation. They don't have the access to, maybe that extra money that mom and dad might need to, drive the car. Maybe there's only enough to just get to work and back, right? It takes away some of these barriers that we see as a struggle when people are in person, right? And ones that we usually help get resources for, at least on our end here at NIRC. We really help people to get services and reduce those barriers to get the help and support that they do need. So those are just some things that are really positive that I've heard from clients of like, hey, these are the things that we've really enjoyed about being able to be on telehealth as opposed to potentially in person. Some of the other things that we talked about that are maybe not as helpful for our clients is like that confidentiality piece, right? We talked about how if somebody's in the next room and they're needing to work, and then maybe you have two kids who are trying to do telehealth or, telehealth for school, right? You have one parent who's trying to get services and, really do therapy. And then you have them like opening the door and be like, hey, dad, hey, mom. And you're like, you get the like, no, true, kind of halfway off the screen, right? Where that's what they're doing. And that just makes it more difficult because it is really hard to stay really present and engaged when you're worried about if somebody might potentially come into the room. You might need to help them with something that they're doing on their Zoom, right? Like kids don't have it all together either when it comes to this Zoom stuff, right? We're learning and so are they. So sometimes we just got to roll with the punches, right? Some of the other things is, right, we talked about technology and how that's really difficult for some folks when like that is not the age that they grew up in, right? Or for our younger folks who are like just learning technology, which I feel like they learn it so fast. My sister's little one is 2, and I swear she already knows how to like scroll and find Mickey Mouse on my phone. And I'm like, I don't even know where you're finding this, right? But these are the things, right? We're all learning together. And I think when it comes to technology, sometimes we are going to have those barriers, right? Sometimes we are going to have okay, well, the Wi-Fi went out, right? Or, hey, we had a big snowstorm. Like this happened while we were in virtual services here. Like there was a huge snowstorm and it took out one of the power lines, and 2 of my clients didn't have access. They couldn't jump back on. They couldn't let me know what was going on, right? And so like having to call them after group and be like, hey, is everything all right? Right? Because a couple people jump off your group and you're feeling a little bit nervous, right? Of like, where did they go? Are they coming back? And so, having to use different ways of technology to be able to get a hold of them. And then having to worry about, okay, like, are you going to have Wi-Fi tomorrow? We don't know. We'll see, right? Which might dictate the way that you as a facilitator have to manage what's going on. The other big thing that my clients really, really miss is this fellowship. So obviously we work in substance use and mental health. And in that capacity, there's a huge part of fellowship, as it comes to like AA languaging, if you guys are familiar with that. But just being able to connect with other people who are going through something similar than you outside of, actually being in group is really, really important for those connections. Right. And so as we talk about, like, they don't get to have the small talk right before or right after or on their, breaks of whatever kind. And so, we have some ways that we can work on that, which really what I've tried to do is make sure that, like, okay, yes, people are allowed to come into group, before I jump onto group. So if they want to get in there 5 minutes early, they could talk with each other amongst themselves before I jump on and start group for the day. Right. And sometimes just like being very intentional about what we're providing, right. And recognizing of like, okay, this is not something I thought of, right, when this was happening. But a lot of my clients brought it up as like, this is really hard. Like, I want to know more about like so-and-so's dog that walked in the background, right? Like just some like small talk to be able to connect on a, on a deeper level. Because especially as we're doing therapy, they're talking about really intimate things, right? And so it really facilitates or really helps to grow that group process, right? Those actual connections that they're making with other people. And we don't realize how something like Zoom, right, or telehealth in general can really take some of those opportunities for that away. So that's one of the things that I've done that's been really helpful. And I hope that you all have some questions moving forward of like, what are ways that you've done this too, right? How have you adapted? Because really that's what this is about, right? Is about how as a facilitator are we adapting to what's going on for the best support of our clients. We talked a little bit about those hybrid difficulties and how, we tried to do half in person and half online. And what we recognize is like my telehealth folks were not excited about the idea. They just felt like they weren't as present, right? Or they couldn't be as present because maybe they couldn't hear as well from somebody who's in the room as opposed to the facilitator, right? Who's probably right next to the computer or the sound machine that we're using, right? Of being able to be like, okay, you can hear me, but then they can't hear the person that's across the room. And that gets really frustrating being the person on the screen, right? And so what we shifted to was like, okay, either we're in person or we're virtual, and we're one of the two. And it's easier to manage, I think, as a facilitator, and more helpful for our clients being able to truly be present with the people who are there, whether they be on a screen or whether they be in person with us. And the last part is, we're going to talk a little bit about this on the facilitator side, but even on the client side, Meagan had talked about when it comes to the research, how, difficult it is sometimes that we lose some people in transition, right? In many different capacities. And what we've noticed here is like, there has been a difficulty with somebody going from IOP right here in our practice, our services, where they go from IOP and they're virtual to me making the recommendation of, I need you to come to PHP and housing, which they're now fully in person. here for a longer period of time. And it's sometimes a really hard sell, right? Even though it is in the best interest of the client, it's a really hard sell to go from, you know, virtual at home where it's very convenient for me, right? I feel more comfortable in this space, you know, et cetera, to being like, I need you to come here in person and I need you to live within our housing, right? It makes for it to be a little bit difficult. And sadly, what we've seen is kind of a drop off in our, you know, our services with them. If that step up is happening, sometimes we can get them to different places that are still doing telehealth in a PHP setting. We've given that option to some folks, but it just makes it even more difficult. So those are some of the client perspectives of what they've experienced. And now we're going to talk a little bit about all of us, right? Because let's be real, we are human and these things have absolutely affected us, right? Until the word Zoom fatigue came out, I thought I was just like, okay, but I'm sitting at my desk all day. Like, why am I like physically exhausted, right? Why do I feel this way, right? Like all I've done is sit here and stare at a screen. Like, can't be that bad, right? I'm not running 5 miles. But what we're noticing is actually with Zoom fatigue, right? There's been multiple studies that have come out. This information is specifically from the Stanford study that was done. And I can give that information for you all afterwards as well, if you want to read over that article, because I think it's really important, right? Because it talks about really giving ourselves a break, right? Giving ourselves a break in the terms of like, we need to get up and walk away from the computer. We need to make time for, truthfully, breaks in between the time we're actually staring at the screen, right? Because what these studies have shown is, number one, right, we're decreasing mobility. So if you notice, right, we're sitting a lot more at our desk because we're not up and moving and talking and all of these kinds of things. Or even when our person is, you know, when our client is in person with us, you know, we're going over maybe worksheets, we're going over, you know, skills, we're doing different things with them. Maybe we're up and standing at some point, showing them something on a whiteboard, right? We're doing these things without noticing. Yet when we're over telehealth, you have no other option, right? You can't be up and moving. The person's not going to be able to see you, right? So we don't notice how much of an effect that plays on us as we're sitting in front of a screen all day, right? And this could be over many capacities. The other part of this is like that close up eye contact. So we talk about this in the way of like, there's a lot of times when I've been instructed, or as reading the research, of like shutting off your self mode. I don't know exactly what it's called on here, but essentially not being able to see yourself, right? Because what happens in our brain, what the research is starting to show, is that we actually are going into more fight or flight mode, right? Our brain is constantly active as we're trying to manage looking at ourselves, which comes with, you know, think about social anxiety, right? Think about going up and having to stand in front of a huge group of people and how anxiety provoking that can be. Now you're staring at yourself, say there's a mirror right in front of you as you're giving this presentation. That's what Zoom has done, right? And we don't think about it from that perspective. That's really what's happening, right? As we're staring at ourselves, we're recognizing and seeing like, oh gosh, that was my facial expression, right? And you're like, whoo, my bad, right? So you're even more self-critical without even noticing, right? And these are the things that are constantly keeping us at that kind of fatigued state, is that we're constantly worrying about what's going on with every single person on the screen at all times, right? If we're in a group setting, we're most likely, yes, we're still looking at other people, but we're primarily focusing on who's speaking, right? And we're doing that over Zoom, but then you can see that, you know, Johnny in the corner is, you know, not paying attention and whatever. So now you're focused on that instead of focusing, you know, there's so many different things to kind of pay attention to. And our brain really goes into essentially overdrive, right? And we're constantly having to be on high alert, which is not what our body is used to, right? Another piece of this that becomes really difficult is that cognitive load that we talked about, right? Being able to look at everything and be observing everything while also trying to focus and be very present to what is going on. You know, it's like that content that's going on, but it's those nonverbals we're still looking for, right? All of these different pieces. So that all goes into that Zoom fatigue. And if you have not looked at this research, please do. And then please use self-compassion, because we are all in this together, my friends. Like, it's really difficult, and we don't, and I think sometimes until we have a word for it, until we, name it to claim it, it feels like, okay, what am I doing wrong? What am I doing that's not working well for me? Why am I always tired? Why are all of these things happening? Well, your brain's on high alert. Of course, you're going to be exhausted by the end of the day, right? When you're using more brain power than you usually do, even if you, had the same amount of individuals and the same amount of groups you ran in that day, right? So finding a little self-compassion in all of this is a huge piece of what we're doing here today. The other piece that we really talk about is the difference in time management, right? Like for me, we talked a little bit about those pieces of, having to pre-plan, right? Because what happens if you're doing a process group, right? And this has happened to me as well. Like you're doing a process group and all of a sudden they're all just like, and you're like, no, this isn't about me. This is about you all, right? Like what else do we got? And if they're at the point where they're done with process, what else do you have in your bag that's ready to go, right? That can be used over this kind of platform, right? Because that's the other piece. If you don't have it pulled up on your computer, now you're scrambling to get, maybe it's something from DBT, right? That you're trying to get up on your screen so you can be able to share it with everybody. If that's not ready to go, right? That makes it a little bit difficult, as opposed to when you're in person, draw it on the whiteboard, right? Have everybody look at it that way, right? You can kind of use it in that way and kind of roll with the punches. It's a little bit different over Zoom, right? Or else you got to use the draw function. And every time I try to tell my folks, like, yeah, let's use the draw function, it doesn't end up working well because I'm not a good artist. But sometimes you got to do what you got to do, right? And you laugh at yourself a little bit, and that's fine, right? There are times that I've drawn stick figures because I'm like, guys, this is as good as we're getting, but I hope you understand the point, right? These are the things that work, right? This is how we kind of talk about more of that unique skill set, really, that I've been talking about. Because really, like Caitlyn was talking about earlier, like, we're kind of a quirky bunch here and we love each other for it. And sometimes you have to show that over Zoom, right? There's so much more humanity to being a therapist, I feel like, over a Zoom platform, because you do have to be animated, right? I talk to my coworkers all the time of like, there are times that I swear, like my clients, think I'm wild or something, because every morning when they come on to Zoom, I'm like, good morning, how is everybody, right? But the reason for doing that is for that engagement, because they don't get to see as much of my body language, right? I'm a therapist that likes to like get up and move and do things. And then if I can't do that, how can I still portray that type of energy, right? That type of personality to be able to really help out, the clients who are just sitting there like, it gets difficult because it's not as engaging, right? If you're over a Zoom platform, it's not as engaging. And as a, facilitator of those different areas, we really have to pull in a lot of skill sets, right? And maybe it is being a little bit quirky and having fun with it. And I think that's what I found has been the most helpful for me. It's just like, what? Things are going to go wrong. And what can we do but laugh about it, right? Like humor is sometimes the best medicine, because it's okay to make mistakes, right? We're all still learning all of this. The last piece that, has really come up for me personally, and I'll talk from my own personal perspective on this, is feeling like an island, right? Because right now, right, in our services, we have PHP who are in person. And usually I'm the one who's stuck, as well as Meagan, who does evening IOP. We get stuck in our office, right? And not in a bad way, right? Nobody's trapping us in here. But what we're doing, right, is doing these telehealth services. And then everybody else is congregating and doing whatever during breaks and all of that kind of stuff. And we're kind of like, okay, we're kind of here with our people, and they don't get to see them as much, right? They don't get to maybe have as much input, maybe in like a staffing situation, right? Where other people have seen, the people who are in person can give other perspectives. They might not be able to do that for, telehealth folks if they didn't have to run a telehealth group. And so you become a little bit more of an island, right? And I think this all goes to show that, at the end of the day, like we need to give ourselves a whole lot more credit than what we're giving ourselves right now for what we're doing here. Because it's so much more than just shifting from virtual or from in-person to virtual, right? There's so many more components to this. And I hope that you give yourselves a little bit compassion after we've really talked about how this impacts us, because we deserve it.
Thanks, Erika. So this, I feel like, is the part that everyone's been waiting for, apart from one, being validated and the fact that this is hard and you're not imagining it. And you feel like your whole life is unscripted at this point, and it's like a choose your own adventure novel, because it is. I think the other piece that's really important for us is like, so what do I do, right? That's the part of every training is, cool, I learned about it, but how does it translate to my day-to-day, my job, my life? And so we have talked a lot informally with our team to kind of put together some strategies and skills. The three of us have met pretty regularly to say, like, what are you guys doing that's working? How are you managing this? So this is a hodgepodge list of all kinds of things. So don't be overwhelmed by all the content. I know Chris is going to get these slides and email them out to everyone who is present today. But I want to start with like a couple basics. And these will feel like no-brainers, and hopefully at this point they are, because we've been experimenting with it for a year. But if you're not familiar, create a non-distracting background. So what's funny is I was just having this discussion with Meagan. I was like, man, I wish my background was as therapeutic as yours, because this is my office space. And so I have a really messy corkboard back here, and the rest of my office is really therapeutic. But my Zoom lens is not the message I would want to portray to clients of like, it's a little chaotic sometimes. And this is that humanity part of like, sometimes there's only so much we can do. I joke that I had to cover an evening IOP session from home. So I was like in my home office. Well, my home office, maybe like some of yours, was supposed to be a second bathroom, and it's a cubby hole. We joke that it's my cupboard under the stairs. I don't have drywall in it. I have a whiteboard hung up and a calendar and a chair. And so it's funny because like I've got, extension cords sticking out, and I'm like, hey guys. So it's really just like creating a background that's not incredibly distracting, but again, realizing everyone's doing the best they can with what they have. Did I have time in a pandemic to build myself a real office in my house I don't have space for? Absolutely not. So that was the best I could do. I'd encourage you, if you haven't tried this before, using headphones is a huge game changer when it comes to audio. So you probably can't tell right now, but I currently have headphones in, as does Meagan. And it's helpful, one, to make sure you're actually hearing everything you think you're hearing. And then also there's a little less space between you and your microphone for that to be transmitted clearly. So I encourage that. One of those things that I remember reading early on in telehealth that I didn't think about is, what are you wearing? Like if you're wearing patterns, some patterns like stripes on a Zoom start glitching a little weird, and people start like optical illusion wardrobe, like very trippy. So I'd encourage you to just be mindful of like, what am I wearing? Am I wearing something that I have a bracelet that jingles every time I move? Those kinds of things can be really disruptive. So just be thoughtful about some of those things that typically when we're in person, attention can kind of tune that out, but on Zoom, it doesn't work that way. Your microphone's not selective attention. So be mindful of that. Try using the different features available on your platform. I know that this was huge for people. It's really transforming what you typically would do in person to something different. So people we saw struggle who were like fantastic therapists, but functioned in a very particular way for therapy. It didn't translate over Zoom. And like, it was one of those do or die moments of, you can keep beating the dead horse, but like, it's not gonna work the same way. So you got to get inventive. And so that's where some of those features come in of, there's breakout rooms, which is a cool way to kind of split off. There's a whiteboard feature that Erika was talking about where, it's not a great drawing, but it kind of works. And so find out what else you have access to. I know that was a big part when we all logged on this morning was, oh, like, what is this feature? How does this work? And so use the things that you have, because they're being developed as we speak to meet the needs people are announcing based on a year of teleservices. Also, most platforms have a whole bunch of tutorials available online. Actually taking some time to watch them is really helpful, because otherwise you really are just kind of guessing and hoping for the best. So that's big. Another important part of telehealth is like, what are your expectations? I know that the jury's been out of like what the right thing to do is when it comes to, oh, you've got to be on screen. You can't have your video off. There's been people who have said like, that's really difficult for some of my consumers because they don't want everyone to see that they're doing this out of their car, and it's because they don't have a home. And so I think that it's really about being mindful and kind of setting your expectation and communicating that with your consumers before you're engaging them on telehealth. Like, this is what I expect. I expect you to, be available. One of the big ones we've experienced is people saying that things don't work that do work. Like, oh, my video's broken. We're like, well, it wasn't yesterday on our individual session. So interesting. So sometimes, like, exploring what's the reason or the struggle or the barrier to doing some of those things. Sometimes it's just being self-conscious, and they're like, oh, I didn't know there was a way that I could not look at myself on Zoom. Super helpful. Muting, one of those like common courtesy things of mute if you're not the one speaking, because otherwise we'll hear your dogs barking and your kids yelling and all the good stuff that happens in our real lives. So just being clear and consistent with those. Erika spoke to this a little bit, but overemphasizing some of your vocal changes and nonverbals. Even just noticing that, so Meagan and Erika are currently providing virtual services, and I noticed that they're all up in their camera. And I find myself, I started there and just have slowly inched my way back from my screen. Like, this is more comfortable. So I think sometimes it's like pushing out of that comfort zone of what you think looks and feels ridiculous to recognize how it comes across. And I know Erika and I had talked, it's kind of like in theater, where if you did things that you do on a stage in a like public space, people would think you were really crazy. But on a stage, it makes sense because you're trying to communicate something across a really broad environment. And so I think it kind of feels that same way. So again, it's kind of amusing. I was just observing. I was like, oh, yep, I'm clearly not the one currently providing telehealth services, just based on how close I am to my computer. Setting up your meeting ahead of time for success. So again, knowing your features is key. A big one that, again, Erika had spoken to is setting it up of like enable join before host. So that way people can join and get on before you start the meeting in that setting for that purpose of intentionality and creating a space. Super helpful. Requiring a password. This kind of goes back to like some of those HIPAA compliance things that Meagan was talking about. You've got features on Zoom at least to authenticate users. So there's just kind of all these, the waiting room, we joke about it's kind of like timeout. Like if you get kicked to the waiting room, like you're in timeout until they let you back in. But knowing what you have at your disposal to make sure that your workflow and your experience for yourself and your clients or consumers makes sense. So some of those might work for you. Some of those might be overkill for you, but use what you need. We talked about the difference between being in person and being virtual is that there's this ability in person for you to just wait out the silence because there's so much nonverbal restlessness and awkwardness that eventually somebody talks. On Zoom, it's so easy to just be like, can't get me. I'm not even uncomfortable in that silent space because the nonverbals aren't there. The tension in the room doesn't feel the same. And so it's really helpful to like call people out that you're trying to reach and being like, hey, Erika, can you comment on that? Or like, what do you think? As opposed to just open-ended questions to the group, because then there's no, like I said, there's just not that same interpersonal energy that causes people to be the first one to speak and then to follow it up. And so doing some strategic things of calling people out, and again, like in a direct way, but in a friendly way. It's like, Meagan, why are you still muted? Not helpful. But like, Meagan, I don't think I can hear you. Did you manage to unmute okay? And so just being strategic in some of those ways that you engage people on the Zoom or other platform. Scheduling breaks away from the computer. And I appreciate what Erika said about like self-compassion is, I don't know about you, but I schedule myself back to back to back with Zoom because I don't have to go anywhere. I'm still sitting right here. So I could do a 9 o'clock, a 10 o'clock, an 11 o'clock, or 1 o'clock. And then all of a sudden I'm exhausted. And it's because I haven't moved from the same scenery in the same chair. And so it's so important, the same way that you would give yourself a break to get across a building or to drive somewhere, like give yourself breaks in your schedule of Zoom life, of virtual life, to rejuvenate, to give yourself the space to kind of, again, that isolation piece is huge for the providers as much as it is for clients and consumers. It's like, if you don't have any breaks built in and you're just Zooming back to back, you'll never accidentally see somebody at the coffee pot. Or see them in the hallway on the way to the bathroom because you didn't go anywhere for 8 hours. So please make time and space to step away and recognize that that's important for you to be a good provider as well. So Recognizing some barriers. So I know we talked about this kind of across the presentation, but appropriateness for virtual engagement. There's some people who aren't going to be successful in that way. And so we've had people who are in our IOP virtually who they just need the fellowship and the community part of their recovery so much that it makes more sense for them to step up to a higher level of treatment to get the human component of treatment, which is crazy to think about, like the world that we're living in right now, that's where we're at. But I think it's really important is just to recognize that some people, when we just recently brought our JIOP program back into the building, and they were all just like, yeah, we'll start next week. Like, we're ready to come in, because they just wanted to connect again. And so I think just being mindful of that people crave human connection. And I know that you guys have experienced it as providers in your own personal lives. So recognizing again, that that's a big driving factor for our folks as well. Using humor, we've talked about a lot. That's a huge part of our team just in general. So it comes easy. You don't have to do like bad knock jokes or anything, but just like having that lighthearted spirit, that playful spirit, you know, where if something's not working technologically, people can sense when you get anxious and tense about it versus when you're like, Zoom again, you guys know how it is, right? And that changes the feel. And then people are able to kind of be helpful. Accept help and embrace humility about technology struggles is huge, because there's times where people have found or stumbled upon features that you didn't know were real. Or you have some people, we've had people in our groups who are literally IT people. And if I was like, oh no, I'll figure it out, I would never have figured it out. Because I joke, but I'm clinical director / Zoom IT for the last year, because I was running out of any kind of meeting to then go and be like, oh, the Zoom's not working, put in the password again. And so a lot of us have taken on kind of this blended role. So recognizing that there's the regular people in the world who accept that you don't know everything about Zoom or your platform of choice, and that's okay. Embracing that humility. Having several backup plans. I know Erika talked about this with that toolbox or that bag of things, like what else are you going to do if this falls apart, is really big, because it's easier to do that in person and play off some of the natural interpersonal energy. It's a lot harder to do on a virtual setting. Communicating reminders is big, and maybe you've experienced this again in your personal life, but if it's not if it's not in front of me, an in-person meeting, sometimes I forget because it's like off in the cloud somewhere. So I have to make physical reminders of like, okay, I've got a Post-it note about this, and I know it's in my calendar, but I'm still also a very much paper calendar kind of person. And so it's really easy to miss out on things that I've scheduled for myself in the virtual world, because it feels like a different reality where I'm like, oh my gosh, no, it's Tuesday. It's Tuesday at this time. I missed X, Y, and Z. And so a lot of providers are doing this where they'll send out an email or a text. I mean, I got a reminder for this about an hour before it started, which is super helpful, just because you also lose track of time. And so when you don't have a physical person knocking on your door saying, hey, it's time for us to meet, it's really easy to miss things. So communicating reminders in ways that are helpful. I know Meagan spoke about like no-shows and dropouts. It's interesting because it could go either way as far as no-shows. Like there's so many less barriers for people showing up that there are less no-shows in that regard. But then there's also the, oops, I forgot. Oops, I overbooked this with something happening in my real life. Because I feel like everyone has that experience of like real life versus virtual life, even though they're the same life. Practice with your internet, audio devices, lighting, platform features before the time you need to use them. It's important, and I think that we don't recognize it sometimes because we're like, oh, it can't take that long. I think we can all speak to the times that we've lost 10, 15 minutes of a meeting to, oh, hold on, no, it's not working right. I think that maybe if I do this, and you just lose so much in that time where you're trying to troubleshoot. So taking that time ahead of time. The physical reminders I know I talked to, and then being open to new methods and understandings. I imagine that this weird world of telehealth, we'll learn a whole lot about it in like the next 5 years and go, wow, I can't believe we did it that way. That was terrible. And we did the best we could with what we had. And everyone's just kind of shooting in the dark right now as we try to make life work in the format we've been given. So I just want to really, again, reinforce that idea of self-compassion that, yeah, we're going to find out we did stuff wrong in the future. And it's okay, because we couldn't have possibly done everything perfectly when, again, we had no infrastructure for this world that we launched into before we launched. You know, it's been about a year since this became the new normal. I know we talk about that a lot, but the new normal has been chaotic. requiring adaptability and flexibility. And so I anticipate that we'll find out all these different things and learn these different ways when we talk about telehealth and the pros of it. I think that we'll find ways to enhance the pros of telehealth as we move forward. And unfortunately, first you have to learn all the cons. So I think it's being adaptable and like getting that feedback, you know, like, oh, this didn't work. Cool. I'm not afraid of the feedback. Like, what didn't work about it? How else could we build it? And I think that everyone understands that that's the world we've had to inhabit. So I haven't noticed a whole lot of people saying like, I can't believe you didn't know that. Because nobody knew that. We all just kind of had to go with the flow and make it up as we go. So all that to say, there's many more strategies and skills that our team is happy to share with you. Our plan next is to move into that panel discussion. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can actually see the chat. And then academics, virtual or distant learning. So I'm just getting caught up on some of these. I appreciate everyone who's responding. So let's see, I'm gonna share just a couple of the comments. I don't know if all of you can see, I don't think all of you can see what I'm seeing. So we were talking a little bit and someone said, thank you for talking about Zoom fatigue. I've been noticing how drained I'm feeling all the time, but not doing a lot of physical activity. So that was helpful. So Nell shared, among the Lakota Sioux Native Americans, there's no word for goodbye. They believe that once the souls have connected, it doesn't matter what the bodies do. Goodbyes don't take place. That thinking is something people who are telehealth dependent can keep in mind. The bodies aren't in proximity, but the souls can still connect. The connection may be even deeper. That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that, Diana. So I want to take the opportunity now. If you guys have any questions, we've got plenty of things that we could touch on or speak to. But if there's anything that really struck you from the presentation or things that you're wondering about your practice, the ways that you maybe have inserted yourself into the telehealth world that have been helpful or not helpful, anything that you want to share or communicate, we can also share. But yeah, if there's any questions, I'll give it, I know this is that awkward part of the virtual world. We're like, I'll give it a minute or two for everyone to type and then we can take a look. It's also a crazy world to say that, like, speaking of no nonverbals, like we really can only see each other. And it's such a different experience to provide a presentation like this. I think especially as clinically minded folks, we're like, are they nodding? Did they all disconnect? Who knows? So I do see that we've got 43 participants though. So I think that, Chris, we might have to make a field trip to Chris. We were all joking at the very beginning of this of how we might need to make a bet on how many people would actually show up because the virtual and the reminders and all that good stuff. Kimberly says, hi, I work in probation and these are all things we run into as well by providing services and recommendations as well as trying to ensure clients stay compliant with court orders. Yeah, we run into that with our folks. I don't know if either Meagan or Erika want to speak to this of like how we manage the difference between legitimate barriers versus like manipulation of kind of a convenient excuse with like technology and things of that nature. So if either of you want to speak to that real quick, kind of in line with Kimberly.
I'll go. So I think the biggest thing for us is just having like really clearly communicated expectations. We work really hard to meet clients where they're at in terms of like legitimate barriers and ways to problem solve those barriers. So a lot of times what that will look like is mutual and like collaborative conversations and identifying, we have a lot of different words for it, but like a mutual agreement plan, a growth plan, some kind of like behavior contract in order to really lay out what those barriers are and the ways that both the provider and the consumer are working together to overcome those barriers to achieve a common goal. So yes, we definitely experience those challenges for sure. And that is an ever-growing process on how to navigate and collaborate with the clients in order to address some of those barriers we see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll definitely say to kind of, yeah, absolutely. So I'll kind of jump on to kind of what Meagan was saying too. And I think one of the biggest things for us here is like, as a facilitator, like trying to find the space and the appropriate way to handle those situations, right? Mm-hmm. So it is a lot more complicated when somebody's like, you know, they bring up maybe a relapse or something like that, or we have to have that conversation with them, you know, if they've had a positive urine drug screen, and then it's over Zoom, right? If they've already had their individual for the week, they might be like, oh, something's going on, right? And I've had clients who are like, I'm not coming, right? Like they will not show up to that session. So it's a very fine way of having to have those. And there was one time that I had to, you know, use other technology. So needing to use my phone, you know, to call them that way and be like, hey, you know, I really need you to jump on this Zoom. This is something that's really important. I really want to, you know, have this conversation with you so that we're able to move through this, right? Because that's the biggest piece. If we're meeting our clients where they're at, really being able to, you know, explain why it's important to have these conversations. And that's a whole lot easier in person because you can just kind of go get them from group and they don't really have a choice. I mean, they have a choice to be there or not. If they want to walk out of the room, that's their choice too. But it's a lot harder over this virtual platform and needing to really change the way that I showed up to these conversations also to be more beneficial for the client.
And kind of along those similar lines, I know Erika and I both experienced this week where both of us did have the experience of having positive drug screens. And that balance between like assessing for level of risk in both of those situations, because we had to schedule those interventions with our clients. Whereas normally, like Erika was mentioning, we would just go and grab the clients out of group that day right away. It ended up being a few days out before we could find that time to meet with those clients individually. So again, going back to what is the level of risk in these situations? This is something that needs to be addressed immediately. Do we have some time to coordinate and schedule? And if it is an immediate need, how do we go about doing that?
Yeah, thanks guys. So one of the questions that I know is huge is, what are some of the biggest barriers or challenges that you've experienced in providing services virtually? So I know we kind of touched on this with specifically like having those difficult conversations with people, having to schedule a difficult conversation is kind of a new experience really for us specifically, I know. But what are some other big barriers or challenges that you've faced while we've been virtual?
So I'll speak to this one first. I think one of the biggest barriers or challenges that I've had is like really trying to create a really connected group. Because they have the ability to sit back. One of the things that I've really adapted on my end is being able to really call people out. Like even if somebody, you know, as you start doing Zoom and have the same folks over Zoom, you start to notice their mannerisms. Even though they're different, right? And maybe those like nonverbals that you'd fully see when you can see the entire person, right? But when somebody like shifts a little bit forward, or, you know, all of a sudden they're sitting all the way back here, right? Like there's a different way of like, and usually what I'll say is I'll call them out and be like, hey, you know, hey, Meagan, I noticed you shifted forward a little bit. Is there something that you wanted to add to this conversation, right? And like starting to learn nonverbals, even when you can only see the person, right? Really silhouette, and that's about all we get, right? So that's been a big barrier, but I think the more that you have that group, the more that they also start to pick up on other people's mannerisms, right? And really having to point those things out. Like I'm very intentional of being like, so I noticed that you turned your mic on and then shut it off. Is there something that you wanted to say, right? And being very intentional about that for the rest of the group to understand of like, you don't just get to sit back just because we're on this kind of platform. So that's been really helpful as an adaptation for myself.
Yeah, similarly, I think I agree that the group dynamics are hard in general. They're hard when we're in person. So navigating the increased challenges to group dynamics over a virtual setting has been definitely a challenge and a barrier. So similarly to Erika, also just incorporating ways to really build rapport with clients and amongst clients. So the importance of that therapeutic relationship that you have through your individuals, along with that, like we've talked about over and over again, the use of humor and just really engaging with those individuals on a human level can be super important. And And I know Erika and myself have both also implemented in our IOP groups, space and time to just have fun with the clients, to incorporate different activities that they can engage in that allow them to have that rapport with each other. And I think another way that we have incorporated that even in our daytime programming is through we have scheduled time on Fridays to be able to have that space to just do a fun activity and to let loose a little bit after a week's worth of therapeutic content.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
absolutely. That's been some of my favorite times to do Zoom is when we get to just have some fun. Right. Obviously, all of the therapy is absolutely important, right? Not to take anything away from what we do on a daily basis, but sometimes just being able to have other people, and realize like we are human and we can do something fun. So like some of the things that I've done is like bring in, one day we did a random trivia game, right? And it was questions that like I didn't even know the answers to, right? And so we just had fun with it. We laughed at each other and we tried to figure it out as a team, in certain ways. There's time we played Jeopardy, right? So it was, recovery Jeopardy, but, to kind of go along our theme, but, it was just fun and they get a little bit of competition in there, right? And you get the like, banter back and forth. Like that's what that's about, right? And really what we're doing is connecting them together in a different way, right? So it's still going along the principles of therapy, absolutely, right? And bringing that rapport for each other and having them feel more connected even when they can't be in person.
I saw someone ask some other examples. I think that another one that we use often is like the use of music over this platform. It is very easy to pull up YouTube and to share that music with our clients. So whether it is like a music trivia or having each client identify like a song that is meaningful to them, music has been really big in our IOP programming too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I would add this as well, because I know when our team was all virtual, when we were all quarantined, we were trying to figure out like how do we still bond? So one, it was like virtual lunches together, but then also there's like a whole bunch of activities. Sometimes it's like knowing the right thing to search on Google. There's remote team building activities. And so there's like all these different ideas. There's different web platforms. So I know that our teacher folks are really used to like Kahoots, which is a fantastic solution to some of those struggles. I know YouTube, there's a bunch of trivia videos that are just like preloaded onto YouTube. You don't have to make anything. And then sometimes it's just the goofiness of like, I'm going to take you on a tour of my house because here we are anyways. Or I'm going to show you, like everyone show their favorite knickknack, or like grab the thing that is to your right. And so just like some of those things to engage people with their environments, because it's the elephant in the room of clearly I'm not in person with you. So how do we make use of the fact that I am somewhere different? How can I engage people in that way? Any other things you guys would add?
Well, I also do like 2 truths and a lie as like a way to just start, right? If you're not necessarily like wanting it to be like a long extended time, maybe you only got like 5 to 10 minutes. That one's been a really fun one because you get to know random facts, right? And usually what I'll do is I'll also participate so they can see me on more of a human level. Obviously nothing that I'm not, wanting to share, right? All of the things are within limits based on the fact that I am, right, the facilitator in that scenario. But it's fun to sometimes be a part of those things too, and allowing the clients to see you from a different perspective. Obviously still a professional one, but one that's a little bit more fun. Obviously we talk a lot about humor and all of that, and that kind of brings that element in that I've noticed.
And I think that this leads well into the question of like, how are boundaries different on telehealth compared to in person? And it goes to that example, Erika, of like, if I see my teacher at the grocery store outside of telehealth, that was a really shocking experience because of the boundary that I had created with the space. And now with the lack of like the 4 walls that we share, I think that that's been a really interesting change as well. So if you want to speak to boundaries, and I saw we had another question just pop in, so we'll answer that one next.
I think for me, the biggest thing when it comes to boundaries is that reflection and that use of supervision, really being intentional and mindful of what is popping up in terms of boundaries? Where am I struggling to like implement boundaries? And that might look like just interrupting or interjecting and like keeping group on topic or on task. So a very like tangible boundary. But again, like the typical ethics of being a social worker in this field of like, what is the intention behind what I am doing? And is it in the best interest of the client that I am serving in this moment?
Mm-hmm. I agree with that. I kind of took that question as more like boundaries that I'm setting with my clients in this group setting, right? Especially as I'm running group, especially as there's a lot of people. Really, I think Meagan talked to it of like managing everybody, right? So when two people try to talk over each other, right? Like stepping in to say like, okay, you can go first and you will go second, right? It sounds very silly, but I think it's really helpful in that way. The other piece of boundaries that I'm really, really set on is really talking with my group about like group expectations and like what is appropriate over Zoom as opposed to what might be appropriate in person, right? Like we had a rule of like, if you need to use the restroom, please just let the rest of the group know. Not, send a group chat. You don't have to like unmute yourself and say anything, but put like, hey, this is what I have to do. I'll be right back. And having that be very intentional because we don't want people just off doing whatever they feel like while they're supposed to be really, in a therapeutic setting. Whereas like, we wouldn't let you wander around and go make breakfast when, you're in a group room with all of us. Please don't do that while you are on Zoom with us. So like, we're not going with you to make your coffee and then do, make a breakfast sandwich. Like, that's not what this is about, right? And so really being intentional with like those group rules in the beginning and having the group be a part of that discussion, right? Not just being like, these are the rules, you must follow them, but really being like, what do you guys think? What would be helpful for this group? What do we want to make sure we hold each other accountable to? And I think that is a really helpful way of setting those boundaries of like, hey, we made this discussion, or we made these group rules together. Can we please all follow them? Right? If somebody's, whatever. And I've had people call each other out, right? After they get close enough, they really do, which is fantastic.
Yeah. And I appreciate Adam's contribution. So he said that boundary with regards to scheduling also. So he said one of the biggest benefits I've had was after implementing availability and scheduling. Just because I'm working from home and available doesn't mean I need to be available the entire day. It was okay to limit what hours I work despite running my own practice and not wanting to say no to clients. And I think that's huge when we talk about like self-compassion and Zoom fatigue. And I know that I work in private practice as well. And so I'm guilty of it too, where I'm like, well, normally I would say I'm done at 7, but because it's virtual and then I'm already at home, that's like a half hour saved in travel. So I could probably do a 7 o'clock session too. So I think that I appreciate your comment, Adam, because it's huge is what kind of boundaries am I setting for myself? Because I know there's been a lot of discussion with virtual services of working from home makes it really complicated to keep those boundaries firm in my own life. When I'm here at work in my office, I'm working. And when I go home, I can turn that off. And it's so much more difficult if, say, my workspace is my, also my bedroom or is also like my dining room. How does that work? How do I disengage? So I appreciate that comment, Adam. And I think it kind of goes well with Savannah's question. So she asked, how do you end sessions and close clients back up and get them ready to be around their families moments after a session when you've discussed something very traumatic? So I think that goes for providers, but if you guys want to speak to that as well, as the client perspective, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, so for me, kind of two pieces. Like the group portion of it, I will intentionally leave time at the end of session to do a checkout and to ask the clients what they need before they leave. I have the fortunate benefit of having a really awesome evening IOP group right now where they will each bring their own like meditation or mindfulness skill. And sometimes we will utilize those prior to leaving. In terms of individual clients, I have done a lot of work with pre-establishing what that will look like ahead of time if we know that we are going to be working on trauma. So implementing skills such as like the calm place, So what is the word and the image and the sensations that you can bring yourself back to in order to decrease that like physical and emotional discomfort before we end session? And similar to evening IOP group, like utilizing meditations or short mindfulness skills, grounding techniques in that last 10 to 15 minutes of session before we leave.
I agree with Meagan wholeheartedly. There is a very intentional way that I go about it as well, of like, especially leaving space. And sometimes what I'll do is, especially if we've had like a really heavy group, we'll do some type of skill, and then we do something that's like just wacky, right? Whether that be like just a random question that I'm like, okay, what's everybody's favorite color? Rapid fire, go, right? And then it's just something to like pull the mind away, right, from what was going on and kind of put it on almost a lighter note. Obviously, that's not always appropriate in certain situations, depending on what you've been talking about. But I think having those skills ready to go, whether that be coping, whether that be grounding, whether that be distress tolerance, right? Having some of these skills that you're like, if you are struggling, here's what you can do, right? And let's go over and do this together before you leave, so you feel more comfortable doing it, right? I've done breathing techniques. I know a big one for me is 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, right? When it comes to grounding and really focusing on that, because then they also have the space that they were just in doing their session and having access to that grounding technique specifically in that space, which has been really helpful for some folks. I agree. Being very intentional is a huge piece of it.
And I think as much as we encourage our providers to be thoughtful in how they schedule, encouraging clients to be thoughtful in how they schedule too, of, are you trying to do this session on your lunch break where you're going right back to work afterwards? Knowing that the content we're probably going to cover is going to be distressing or challenging. Is that the best time? Is that the best scheduling? Versus I'm going to do it after my work day's over, and after a session, I'm going to plan to take a walk, or I'm going to give myself 15, 20 minutes to just like, again, engage in some of those self-care things that maybe you've been working on or building. So if you're, you've got a client who's been working on utilizing a hobby like gardening or art or something, saying like, hey, why don't you build that in as something you use to transition yourself as well from our content back into life, but kind of in a gentle way, because it can feel really abrupt with the like, oh, well, we left the meeting, and so now I'm back in my real life as opposed to my virtual life. And so I think creating some kind of bridge between those two realities is important too. So that goes to an additional question. So what do you guys think are the pros of telehealth, some of the positives or the benefits, maybe from like client experiences or things that they've shared? I know we kind of touched on a few bullet points, but like any major ones that stand out that were big?
For me, I think the accessibility piece is huge, especially being in a setting where people are traveling from a lot of different places in the Chicagoland area. And with people going back to in-person work, but still engaging in that telehealth therapy in their available hours. So that has been something that's been really helpful in terms of scheduling and being able to have just more availability, especially from my like private practice clients, because they're able to continue to receive services that otherwise they would have had to stop just based on like the scheduling aspect of it.
I agree with that. I think that's been one of the biggest things that I've heard from clients as well, is like just the accessibility and being able to say like, hey, I am going to be getting out of work, right at that time, but I can still make that work. It only takes me 10 minutes to get home, and I'll be right there. Instead of maybe having to travel, from one county to the next, just to come in person for that day. And that's been really helpful for me on my end of being able to say like, okay, we can schedule you at different times. We can schedule times that are more convenient for you, because you're able to do it from this platform, right? Like even for day IOP right now, right? Like there are some folks who, would still prefer to do their individual session via telehealth just because it's easier for them and they don't have to drive, right? Then back to, clinical to come have an individual session after being here for 3 hours and going home, right? So it gives that level of convenience that can be really helpful on both ends, both on a scheduling platform when it comes to being the facilitator, and for the client in general.
And I would add, and you guys might find this as well, I think it adds options for our consumers. So there might be places that I picked because of just like physical convenience. So maybe I picked this private practice, even though there's a therapist who I'd really like to work with, but they're further away. There's kind of that ability to get more specialized and intentional with your service provision, and what you really are looking for. And so I find that that's something that's helpful for people as well, is things that were never on the table because of those barriers now are available to people because it can happen virtually, or it can happen. I was just thinking about this when we were talking earlier, the difference in, and I know there's some downsides on the school side of things, but like weather, inclement weather. We live in an area where we have that quite regularly for large parts of the year. And so the ability that people don't have to skip receiving their services that they need because there's snow coming and they don't have a reliable car, they're worried about their tires or their, things like that. So there's safety also for the providers. Obviously, we're not then driving home at 9:30 at night in a snowstorm, and everyone still gets what they need. And I think that's been a really cool opportunity as well, is that service provision doesn't have to be limited by some of the previous barriers. Absolutely. What do you guys think is the future of telehealth? What are we going to do with it?
I think we've all kind of come, I know we talked about this a lot in our setting, like telehealth is probably here to stay. So I think that it will be present in the future as an alternative option, and something that will continue to fill that gap in terms of accessibility.
I actually would be really interested to hear what everybody else's opinion. Obviously, you guys can't like talk about it. Please chat about it, because truthfully, like this is one that I've gone back and forth about, more in our setting than anything else, because there are so many pros to it of like convenience and accessibility, and especially for like outpatient. I think in many different settings, it's really helpful, and even people being willing to get services has been a big piece. So, yes, I 100% believe that like now that we have this, like it's not going anywhere. It's, for that access. And there's also part of me that's like, in certain situations, things look different, right? We talked about, the difference between somebody being in IOP virtually as opposed to, potentially being in IOP in person, and how different that experience is and how different that connection is. So like for me, when it comes to like specifically what we do here, right, working with folks who are struggling with substance abuse and mental health, in a setting where, they're here for a longer period of time, longer hours in the day, I go back and forth, right? I've seen some of my folks do unbelievably well and make it through our entire program, and just flourish, right? Even with their connections, even with the support from the other group members and making those connections with them, in, how as Caitlyn was talking about it, like in like real life, right? As opposed to like over this virtual setting. So I've seen it work really well, and I've seen it work really negatively for a lot of folks. And work against them in many ways, especially when it comes to that barrier of like step ups, right? Mm-hmm. So going from an IOP program that's virtual to like being in PHP or needing to potentially go into residential, which is going to be in person, right? And so for me, it's like, I go back and forth. Like I see the benefits and I see the helpfulness that it can be, but maybe at lower levels of care. And with IOP kind of being that bridge, right? That bridge of like, okay, we can have both and it's going to work maybe for both ends. But I can't imagine like a residential facility ever going telehealth. Like that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, just with level of care, right? And what's needed and what's provided at that level of care. So I'm on both ends, I suppose. I got a little bit of both.
So controversial question, is telehealth a different level of care than its in-person counterpart?
I would say yes. Again, back to like Erika's point of like, it depends on the level of care. I have seen like in a individual outpatient setting, just doing like once weekly sessions, that there has been a good balance. Like for some people, if they are appropriate for telehealth services, like they are able to benefit in the same way that they would if we were meeting in person. And a lot of that had to do too with like pre-established relationships and like pre-established rapport with those individual clients. And then on the next level of care, like the IOP setting, I would say that there is definitely like some discrepancies. We talk a lot about how like even just the informal interactions of walking through the hall and seeing people makes a huge difference for our clients in terms of like their level of connection with each other, but also their level of accountability. Accountability is huge in this population, and that is an area that has been really challenging in the virtual context.
I agree with Meagan. Obviously I don't have personally the experience of doing telehealth in an outpatient setting, so I can't speak to that. But what I can speak to is when it comes to, IOP in general, there has been some times where, I think Meagan, you had talked earlier where I've had a client who used a substance before coming onto telehealth services for IOP. And obviously that looks very, very different from, being in a telehealth setting where you now have to, like, this is a crisis situation, right? And thank goodness I was able to like have other people who could, reach out and call and all those kind of things and do wellness checks while I was finishing up services. But obviously that looks very different, right? Just a level of support that we can provide. Because I think this also comes on our end of like, what are we really able to do in the most effective way, right, as facilitators? And so on my end of things, when it comes to, if somebody used before walking in the doors of our building, that would be handled immediately, right? There is a very big difference in, like, obviously they're both emergent situations, right? But how do we manage that looks very different via telehealth. And so for maybe some of those folks that need more of that accountability, need more of that support and human interaction, would do better potentially in an IOP setting, right? I wanted to say something that didn't make sense. So to go back to it of like, right, if they're coming in person, maybe there'll be an extra barrier to them using that substance before walking in the door, as opposed to the convenience of being at home and potentially using that.
I think another thing too for me is we like take for granted how big of an impact the other like supporting staff have with our clients. So whether that is our behavioral techs or our case managers, which don't necessarily have interactions with our virtual IOP people, or our administrators like Caitlyn and our CEO and our office manager. They all have so much to them as humans, and they have so much to provide our clients in terms of like additional support and human interaction. And those are all things that easily get lost in the virtual world.
So Meagan, you alluded to screening for appropriateness for like telehealth. And so I'm curious if there's things that you're noticing consistently, and those who are in the training, I'd love to hear your feedback. If you have any screening kind of questions you've implemented, or you found any kind of patterns as well, but are there certain consistently types of people who do well in telehealth versus struggle in telehealth? And like, how could we screen those people to be in the right level or supportive interface for care?
Really, it has been just trial and error up to this point for me. So I think just like anecdotally, the things that I've noticed that have been successful are those clients who are really self-sufficient. Those clients who are willing to be really intentional about their level of engagement. They are responsive to phone calls and emails. They are open and willing to reach out and ask for help when they are struggling. Those are the ones who I see as being the best candidates. Also, that level of like having a good outside support system has been really beneficial as well. In an outpatient setting, I think I mentioned this earlier, it's been interesting to see just the changes in the populations that I have served. So I was primarily a child and adolescent therapist, and now my clients in an outpatient setting are almost exclusively adults, with the exception of some like 17, almost 18-year-olds. So that challenge with engagement in terms of like age has been something that's been super prevalent. And then also just some specific like diagnoses that I have noticed, like clients who I have who are on the autism spectrum or who have really severe ADHD and struggle with attending on a screen. Those are some things that have been barriers.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. One of the big pieces for me is willingness. Mm-hmm. Because what I have found just with us doing telehealth here for almost a year now, right, is that there is a different level of engagement that is needed, because so much more of the onus and so much more of the accountability almost relies on you, right, as a human, as opposed to maybe relying on the rest of the group for that support, right? And obviously that's going to take time to develop. So in the beginning, there needs to be, for me, some type of willingness, right? I'm willing to meet you wherever you're at, and there's a difference between maybe being successful in a virtual setting as opposed to being in person. And there were people even, that I had on my caseload from PHP that I was like, I don't feel comfortable with you stepping down to 3 days a week of evening, right? Because it's virtual right now in all these pieces, and we have a lot more that we need to kind of work on before we get to potentially that outpatient at 3 times a week in a virtual setting. I think appropriateness for care in that way too, as it comes to step downs.
Offering an invitation into the chat real quick before we have to wrap up today. I think one of the things that is just like a classic when you're talking about providers at the end of a training, you're always like, okay, we're coming to the end. How do you take care of yourself? And it always kind of ends that way. And I think it's because we think of ourselves last. Like we've spent so much time bending over backwards in the last year to continue to provide services to people that we really care about. And sometimes we're not good at caring about ourselves in that sense, because we think like, oh, everyone's in a crisis right now. And so like, we really have to step up and be kind of the savior of the crisis. Like it's our job and our responsibility to be there in the trenches with our people. And sometimes I think we forget, I know I forget, that I'm also a person in the trenches of my own life. And I am a human before I'm a provider. And so realizing that people really are in this position of trying to be, and there's some research coming out, some articles coming out now, but trying to be the provider, and you're burning it at both ends, right? Because you're like trying to keep your life afloat, and then you're also trying to keep your population, your clients afloat. How did you find a way in the last year? Like, what are there any times that stand out that you've like failed miserably at it, that have been like a learning point or a turning point for you? And then what have you done as a result to kind of build in that space for yourself as a person?
So for me, I think times where I have failed miserably is this kind of going back to Adam's point of like, I'm available, so why not? Overbooking, overscheduling. And for me, that also includes like social time. I know early on in the pandemic, a lot of people were seeking to schedule like virtual hangouts amongst friends, family, especially during like holiday time. And so I was providing services all day here in person at the PHP level of care, doing outpatient private practice in the evenings and on Saturdays, and then also like behind a screen doing virtual like hangouts with the people in my personal life. And so again, speaking back to kind of like Adam's point of having that boundary within myself to be able to decline invitations, to be really intentional and mindful about scheduling and not stretching myself too thin in terms of appointments. And then really utilizing the free time that I have to work on that self-care piece. So being intentional and mindful with my free time so that it is something that is filling my cup rather than another thing that continues to drain or isn't serving me in a helpful way.
I absolutely agree with Meagan of like, there is such pressure. I think that I placed on myself, especially when I was working from home, because when I'm not in the work setting, my boundaries get a little blurred, right? My work-life boundary gets a little bit blurred. And so what I was noticing is I was like working longer. I was working, back to back to back as I could. I wasn't taking those breaks that I needed to, right? Even if I was giving my clients breaks, like when I was doing IOP, right? I intentionally put breaks into our IOP, just like we do when we're in person, because I think it's important. And what I found is like, I was sitting there then doing, right? Then still on the computer, like, oh, I'll just get my note done in between this, right? I was never taking the time to do that for myself and didn't realize that how much of an impact it had on me until I was unbelievably drained. And I noticed that more in my personal life, because what I was recognizing is because work was bleeding into that time, I wasn't taking any time to fill myself back up in whatever way I needed to, right? And so that has been the big change, but it came at the cost of myself first. And I think that is something that I've been very intentional about, of like, I can't do this anymore, right? I think somebody just said in the chat too, right? Like the oxygen mask, absolutely, right? Of like putting it on yourself first, but as this profession, I think that gets really difficult, right? I think we kind of take on that like hero mentality in many ways, especially as we're living in the world that we're living in. And I've definitely put that pressure on myself and saying like, nope, I'm going to do it all, right? I'm going to be Superwoman. This is going to be fantastic. I'm going to get all the things done, right? And what I realized is like, I was pushing myself too far. And like Meagan had said, like stretching myself way too thin to the point where it came at a cost of me and my health.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think kind of to link, Erika, your point to Michelle, who shared this with us, she said, I felt a lot of pressure to be available virtually when I was sick. No one put that pressure on me. It was all me. It feels like I should be available if I am home while sick, because I know my clients have needs that I want to be able to support. And so I put that to like sick, to time off that you plan to take. I've definitely been guilty of this, where I'm like, I'm out of the office. And then I like log into the team meeting in the morning and they're like, what are you doing? And I was like, oh, well, I could, so why not? And so I think that there's sometimes just that sense of, and this is where I was kind of hinting with the schools and the snow days, is like, are we sometimes sacrificing the amount of time where we think this is how much like how productive I have to be? I think a lot of us have worked for agencies where we're measured on our productivity. And so this is their kind of dream in that sense of like, look how many more hours you could get. Because even if 3 people no show, you could just schedule 3 more real quick and they can nobody has barriers to transportation. And so I think that that's huge in the sense that, yeah, like technically nobody's putting that on us. Like no one dares say like, hey, when you're homesick, you got to get on. But there's this thing that we just can't disconnect from at times. And there's this sense that I'm responsible for people, right? I know that I get on the meetings when I'm not supposed to, because I'm like, well, I'm part of the team and I want the team to know that I'm here if they need me. Well, yeah, but there's also a reason that there's PTO and there's obligations and there's sick time. And so, I appreciate Michelle bringing that up, because it's huge, is that sense of like the unspoken pressure, like now everyone can be available anytime. So why not? And even when we first got into this COVID world, we as a leadership team were having meetings on Zoom, of course, every day that lasted at least an hour, sometimes up to 2 hours, just to try and like put the pieces together and make a new plan for service provision. And it was, happening at 6 o'clock at night, 8 o'clock at night, because, well, we could. So, that's just what made sense. And so I don't know if either of you can add anything to that, of just kind of that need to always be on and be available.
I think for me, like one thing that has stuck with me, like my career, is actually something that came from Caitlyn. So this idea that like you as a provider cannot be the end all be all. The people in our lives have like existed before us, they will exist after us. And so being really intentional about like empowering both like our peers and our coworkers and our staff, but empowering our clients to also be able to take care of themselves in that time. because we are not going to be there forever. And we as providers don't want to foster a sense of dependency. We want them to be able to take care of themselves and to progress into a place where they don't need us anymore in that way. So that's something that is just a reminder to me when I'm in that space.
Absolutely. And I was actually going to say something similar. So I actually had a mentor when I was first starting out in the field who had made the comment to me of like, okay, and what's going to happen if you don't answer?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And like always keeping that in my mind of like, is there other people on your team that can take care of this? Are there people above you, next to you, whatever, that could take care of this? Does it have to be you? Right. And being very intentional about that. And right, especially with the level of care that we provide, being very intentional about what we can offer, as opposed to what we, what is going to be the most helpful, right? Like, because we could be there every moment of every day. Absolutely. If we really wanted to, we could, right? And I think in my own heart, I have that drive to be like, so how can I help? Right? How can I help? And being there and stretching myself in many different directions to make sure I'm providing that, right? Like there are times when I find myself checking my email on the weekends and being like, oh, something happened. There was a crisis situation. It was my client. Now I have to respond, right? And then I realize like a bunch of other people have already responded. They're already handling the situation. Did I really need to look at my email while I'm spending time with my friends, right? Or my spouse or whomever. And so I really put that into question, and I really sit back and say like, okay, does it have to be me? And if it does, then fine, right? Like I want to jump into the fire to start with, so like let's do this, right? But if it doesn't, right, if it's the weekend, if it's after hours, and whatever, if somebody needs to get a hold of me, if I need to be that person, I will be notified. And really, having a really good team, truthfully, makes a huge difference in that for me. So like being here has been really helpful, like being at NIRC, because we do help each other out, right? And we will get that phone call if it's absolutely necessary, but not until we've gone through every other option before getting to, especially as a therapist. Can't speak from Caitlyn's side of everything either directly, but.
Yes. Well, and I appreciate your guys' feedback, and I just want to encourage you all to continue the conversation, because it really is a moving, breathing thing that is telehealth services and provision. And so I think the more we can come together and validate each other's experiences and brainstorm what is and isn't working, the closer we come to the place where telehealth is more pros than cons. So I just want to thank you all for joining us today. Chris, I don't know if there's anything you need before we sign off, but I'll turn it over to you if there is.
So just a reminder that I will be emailing out later today the recording link, the slide presentation, and an evaluation link. And then CEUs would be available if needed. But that's it. Thanks so much for providing this presentation and panel discussion. Very helpful.
Absolutely. Thank you all. Continue keeping on, and we are here if you ever need us.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you guys.